Hi everyone, welcome back to another video at Talent500 channel. In today's video, we are going to talk about NoSQL and SQL databases. My name is Kushal Vidya. I'm a software engineer and a content creator by profession. In the last video, we have discussed about some amazing topics which are very important with respect to interviews at big tech companies for full stack development roles. Make sure you watch the full series. The series is in continuation of the previous one. In today's video, we'll be talking about NoSQL and SQL database interview related questions. So let's get started. Today we'll be discussing about most common interview questions or most asked interview questions for senior levels at big tech companies related to NoSQL and SQL databases. When it comes to full stack development roles or backend roles, databases are a core topic which is very important with respect to interviews. So let's get started. Before moving ahead, I want to share some recap of the previous video. If you haven't watched the previous video yet, make sure you watch it before going through this. We have talked about Java, React and AWS interview questions which are very important when it comes to getting backend roles at big tech companies. So let's get started with advanced questions on SQL first, which is structured query language by the full form. We'll be going through some amazing questions. Let's get started with the first one. So the first question is, what is the difference between blocking and deadlocking? Now let us understand it with an example. For example, you have two processes, process A and process B. The process A is actually consuming a resource. For example, resource XYZ. The process A has logged the current resource and process B requires the same resource. Now process B cannot acquire the resource because resource A has a lock over it and is consuming it. And in this scenario, the SQL server does not interfere and does not do anything like stopping the process in this scenario. So this is the scenario of blocking. Now what is deadlocking? Let's understand it with an example. You have a process A, you have a process B, and both of them are using some resource. Process A is consuming a resource A, process B is consuming a resource B. Both of them have put a lock on respective processes. Along with the lock, now process A requires resource B. Similarly, process B requires resource A. So the situation they run into is an infinite loop where one requires the other and the other requires the first one. It's a never-ending process, and this situation is called a deadlock. Now in such a situation, the SQL server interferes and voluntarily stops any one of the process to get rid of the scenario or to remove the deadlock. Hope you guys understand what I'm trying to say. So whenever such a question is asked in an interview, it's better to explain the situation in the form of an example, keeping it more real to the real world scenarios, not taking some random scenarios, but more relating it. For example, there are two servers, they are consuming a similar resource, and talking in terms of situation which can actually occur in a real world. Now let's move on to our next question, which is, what do you mean by ETL in a SQL structured query language? What does ETL stand for is extract, transform and load. It's a simple process which starts from extract, basically extracting data from a particular source, which can either be a data warehouse or a database or a CRM. Similarly, once we get the data, we have to transform that data or basically restructure that data using some processes like cleansing, standardization, deduplication, verification, and sorting of that data. Basically transforming that to get meaningful information out of it. Now once the data is being processed, the last process is loading. Now what does the process of loading include? It includes transferring the transformed data to a new destination. And it can be done via multiple ways. For example, there are multiple types of loading which exist. One is full loading and the other is incremental loading. So let's move on to our next question. It's a very interesting question where you can be asked the difference between white box testing and a black box testing. Now it's better to explain the differences one by one, comparing each and every parameter. And we'll be doing it in a similar manner so that you understand how you need to explain such kind of questions in an interview. Now when it comes to black box testing, its internal structure of the program is hidden from the testers. Whereas in white box testing, the internal structure, like the testers are aware of the internal structure. Further, for black box testing, it is done by software testers, while white box testing is done by software developers. White box testing is also known as internal software testing, while the other is known as external software testing. When it comes to black box testing, programming knowledge is not required for testers, but in white box testing, programming language is a must. You cannot proceed for white box testing if you don't know a programming language. Then lastly, we can give examples of testing or the other names or the types of testing which exist. Like for example, black box testing has multiple types like functional testing, non-functional testing, regression testings, while the white box testing has path testing, loop testing, and condition testing as their types. Moving ahead to our next question, which is how, if the interviewer asks you, compare stuff and replace statements. Now, instead of going through a definition, it's better to explain such a question with an example. Now, we'll be taking an example of a string here where we'll be applying operation stuff as well as replace operation on the string, and we'll understand what is their functionality using the example. So when it comes to stuff statement, what it basically do is it inserts the specific characters in a string, replacing the existing characters. For example, we had a string Raman, and then we kind of replaced the second to third character with a new string, and it has been replaced here. But when it comes to replace statement, it replaces existing characters with specific character throughout the string. In the replace example, we had a string Ramanathan. So wherever there is an instance of an, it replaced it with ar. So this is how you have to explain such kind of problems in an interview, basically with an example. Moving ahead to our next question and the last for SQL question, which is what are the factors which can affect the performance of a query? So the performance of the query depends upon the number of processors we have to compute the query, the node types that exist in the database, how the data is distributed in the database, is the data sorted or not? If it is sorted, how it is being sorted? What is the size of the data set that we are going to query? What is the number of concurrent operation that is being processed on the database? Or what is the query structure? For example, if it has like more number of joins, it will take more time. Then code compilation obviously is something which caters the performance of a query which is being written in SQL. So these are the questions we wanted to discuss for the SQL. Now next we will move to the NoSQL questions. So let's talk about the first question for the NoSQL databases. What do you know about polyglot persistence in NoSQL databases? So let's understand it with an example. It's basically a hybrid approach which enables the usage of multiple databases for a single application or a software. Now, for example, if you have a e-commerce website, the carts that the user consume needs to be highly available to the buyer at each and every moment. And to easily manage this particular scenario, a hybrid concept of polyglot is very useful. Basically, it enables easy management of the resources available. This hybrid technology helps the database give suggestions to the buyers as well. As you can see in the image, the e-commerce platform has shopping cart and sessions data, which is stored in key value store, the inventory and item price, which is stored in another database, the customer social graph, which is stored in graph store, and completed orders in document store. So we are consuming multiple databases for a single application, which is the e-commerce platform. And this particular approach is known as polyglot persistence in NoSQL databases. Let's move on to our next question. Now, how does the NoSQL database control machine price range memory? That's a very important question. You need to explain it in points to the interviewer. So in NoSQL databases, the replication node actually manages the data and is the main consumer of the memory. The Java heap and the cache length that the replication node consumes or utilize are the critical performance factors. Now, by default in replication node, the heap and the cache lengths are calculated by the amount of memory available in the storage. Specifying the available memory in the storage is highly recommended. The memory can calmly be divided into all the replication node if the garage node or the root node has a couple of replication nodes. So this is how the NoSQL database consumes machine price range memory, basically utilizing Java heap and the cache length in an optimal manner, and also calmly distributing the memory among replication nodes if the garage node hosts a couple of replication nodes. Moving to our next question, which is why and how impedance mismatch happens in a database. Now, an impedance mismatch can happen when accessing a relational database in an object-oriented programming environment because different programming languages have different approaches to access data. Now, some of these differences could be type references. Object-oriented programming languages do a heavy use of by reference attributes, while in relational databases, this is typically prohibited. Further, scalar types are also differ between the database and the object-oriented languages. In object-oriented languages, they made up of other objects, while this is impossible in relational databases due to integrity issues. In RDBMS, we have well-defined primitive operations for manipulating and querying, but in object-oriented programming language, we have much lower operations. In relational databases, we have robust approaches for transactions to preserve atomicity and consistency of the database, while the only way to guarantee it in object-oriented programming language is at the level of primitive field types. So these are some of the differences that you need to explain while explaining why impedance mismatch or how impedance mismatch happens in a database. Moving to our next question, which is, what do you know about big SQL in a NoSQL database? So big SQL is a high-speed performance database that is developed by IBM, and it follows massive parallel processing SQL engine for a large amount of data managed by the Hadoop. Mainly enterprise data is stored by this process. By using big SQL, companies access data from across the organization with permission of the administrators, and it is fully secured. So it's a general introduction, a general brief about the big SQL database in a NoSQL. It's a high performance database which uses massive parallel processing SQL engine to basically process the large amount of data. Last question for NoSQL database is, how do you track data record relations in NoSQL? Now you need to follow multiple steps to track data records in NoSQL. You need to first embed all the data in any user object, then create the user ID credentials. By using the login ID, add comments value with a list of comments, and once you're done with these, expected data can be found. So these are the 4 steps that you need to follow in order to track data records in NoSQL. So we are actually done with all the important questions that we have in NoSQL databases. For the next part of the series, you can expect Angular and Azure related questions. We'll be talking a lot of things around those. I hope you have learned something out of this video. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video for more such amazing content. We'll be producing more videos in this particular series. If you have any doubts, please make sure to comment down below, and let's meet in the next video.